welcome back, our loyal Lit Happens listeners, to our episode on the Tempest. We are in episode 6 of season 2, and we are jumping into our text-based sort of discussions, which we see were pretty popular back in our first season. So, what better way to get started with the Tempest, Shakespeare's Tempest in particular? And we had our wonderful Belle joining us this morning to break it down like she did previously. However, this time she's got a lot more vigor
Hi
and
everyone.
a lot more depth. So if you enjoyed the first episode, just be ready for this second ep. I think we're going to be in for a right old time. I'm not going to have any puns or anything at the moment with those storms or the analysis. I don't know where I'm going. Anyway, Bill, how are you going?
Mhm. I'm well, thank you. I'm well. How are you? We're about halfway into the term now. Just times just flies, doesn't it?
Yeah, 100%, 100%. It's actually moving very quickly, and we're sort of what is it, week 5 now or week 4,
Mhm.
depending on which school you're in. But yeah, it's been a little bit of a
Yeah,
interesting
absolutely.
start to the year, I would say. But look, teachers are probably digging deep into their
Definitely.
texts now, right in the thick of things with the analysis, and I guess they'll be able to even use this as a resource for
Mhm.
their students to listen through and just be like, hey, listen to this episode. Look
Mhm.
what's going on. So I'm really excited actually, and I'm excited about the next
Mhm.
few weeks where we will be breaking down a few texts as well, and hopefully allow teachers to use this as
Yeah, me
a
too.
resource or further resource for their students. But look, without further ado, let's move on to our little quit for this week, and let's have a little bit of a laugh for this
Mhm.
morning. So, little quit for this morning is treating Prospero like the ultimate toxic boss in your classroom discussions. Is that little quit, Bell?
Yeah, that's a good one because I could see how he fits the mold of a, toxic boss, sort of throws around his authority and doesn't think twice about his underlings. So I definitely can see the comparison there. That's a good one. I personally would kind of err a bit away from that only
Yep.
because like I think it's a great analogy, but only because I think what it misses is that real contextual those contextual forces that
Mm,
underpin Prospero. Like yes,
yeah.
he, waves around his authority, and yes, he perhaps doesn't treat, others as he should. But I
Mm,
think the thing with Prospero is once he gets to the end, he does become quite a redeeming character. He
yeah.
kind of reminds me, to be honest, a little bit like of the character Michael Scott from The Office. You know how the first few
Yeah.
seasons, we all just hate him. Like he's
Yep.
so
Yep.
cringe because he doesn't think about anyone else. He's so selfish, and then you get in the latter half of the seasons, and he becomes, this one. He's had this wonderful character arc where
Mm,
he actually becomes really thoughtful and really cares about his workers. And I think that's it's a really, really nice arc that develops where you can
yeah.
start off with that idea of the ultimate toxic boss, but there's a lot of like learning and growth that happens.
Yeah.
Now obviously Tempest is a short play, maybe that character arc can't be super fulfilled, but I do love this idea of starting with that idea of the toxic boss and then
Yeah.
looking at how that's represented in the text and then moving forward. Yeah, it's a great
Yeah.
question.
No,
I like
that's
it. What are your thoughts?
yeah, look, I think for me it's a lit way of actually introducing us to one of the main sort of characters in the Tempest. And I think one of the things that
Hmm.
resonates with me if we initially sort of go through those plays is these students in particular in year 11 and 12, like stage 6. A lot of them are actually probably getting into like their casual workspaces at the moment, and a lot of them are experiencing real world situations in the
Hmm.
workplace. So things like uh,
Yeah.
micromanagement from the sideline, or the manipulation, some of the threats when it comes to the management style that we might see with
The
Prospero.
politics. Yep.
Exactly right. So we start to see that, and I think by making it
Hmm.
relevant to the students'
Definitely.
worlds, it's definitely a way in. It's a way in students can start to, I guess, enjoy the real life relevancy, and I think it's definitely a nice way of. It's up to question whether he is a toxic boss or not. Like you said, he's got a bit of a redemption arc towards the end.
Mm.
However, it's a nice way for me. Like I think it's a lit
Very
way of
way
actually.
though of introducing him.
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly right. It's a great way of actually, in a way, it's like gaslighting. You're probably getting the students in, you're hooking them in, and then they'll all start to have the conversation. So I think it's a great way of just getting the conversation happening
Yeah,
with your students, and they'll be interested because then they'll start to connect everything with,
definitely.
oh yeah, like is this happening or that happening? And
Their
I
own
just like that real,
experiences.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly right. I like that real world link. So I definitely think it is lit in the way
yeah, great.
in which it actually becomes relevant to our classroom. But look, that's a bit of fun for us to start us with this morning's episode.
Definitely,
Let's move. Let's move
definitely.
into the text. I think this is probably what our teachers, our students, everyone is probably going to be looking forward to, and I definitely have my ears on, and I'm ready to sort of see where we go with our discussion this morning. So let's start off with just a question about the world in which the Tempest is written. So, what world are we entering in the Tempest, and why is it important for the context to be understood? So, why does context matter?
I think you and I, Drill, thought that Tempest would be a good text to separate from its Hag Seed
Mm,
comparative text,
mm,
because obviously we're moving into the new syllabus, and I know a lot of schools and teachers will be keen to be using Tempest in year 11 now.
yeah,
Hagseed has now gone into the extension course. And we
yeah,
just thought that this might be a nice episode for teachers who might be in the next couple of terms looking at this as one of their core texts. And so,
yeah,
in terms of what world we're entering with the Tempest, it is Shakespeare's one of his last comedy, written around
mm,
1611. So in that like Jacobean slight post-world Elizabethan era, sorry. So it's a
yeah,
really rich text. The play follows the protagonist Prospero, who is a
mm,
sorcerer and the rightful Duke of Milan. However, he has been usurped by his brother, and therefore, in that usurpation, he's marooned on a remote island with his daughter Miranda. They've been there for a bit over a decade here, and so in the world of the Tempest on the island, he uses his magical abilities, and then as our play sort of starts to kick off in its storyline, Prospero orchestrates this tempest that's going to shipwreck his usurping brother, who Antonio,
mm,
who is on a ship with some of the other characters of the play. And so that's how it sort of begins. And the
yeah,
narrative then leads us into a story that's filled with enchantment, ideas of revenge and vengeance, certainly, then
mm,
ultimately reconciliation. But power, authority, and the complexities of being human are really cleverly put on the stage here.
yeah,
I think you can certainly, once you read it, you can certainly feel how it's one of Shakespeare's latter plays. It's very
yeah,
well developed, very clever, lots of fantastic ideas, and a real like magical,
yeah,
whimsical sort of nature to the play, which is probably a little bit different from some of the other ones we've looked at. But
mm, mm,
that's the kind of the world that we're entering. But if we're that's maybe more storyline the world. But if we're looking at context, there are quite a few key contexts at play here. These I think are really important because I don't believe your students will understand your characters' actions and motivations and behaviors
mm,
unless they have an understanding of some of these core contexts. So I thought I might run everyone through a handful of
yeah,
them. And then obviously, depending on what you're doing in class, there might be some front runners that you decide to take on board. So
yeah,
first and foremost, if we're looking at the historical context, so as I said, in that Jacobean period, so historically in that time, magic and the supernatural is
mm,
starting to be of interest. We know that it's not the only Shakespearean works that deals with the supernatural. Like you and I talk about Macbeth quite a lot as one of our
yeah,
favorites, for example.
yeah,
Yeah, but in this one, we've also got that historical context of the real raw nature and complexity of human emotions. Um,
mm,
and that's being
mm,
really represented in Elizabethan drama and literature of that time. And the other
yeah,
big contextual historical area here is colonization, right? So that
yeah,
late 16th, early 17th century with this European exploration and
mm,
colonization, which England really is at one of the front runners of.
yeah,
And then in that kind of colonization, we're looking at the power exploitation
yeah,
between colonizers and indigenous peoples, and that plays
yeah,
out really, really deeply and richly in this play. It's probably
mm,
one of the contextual elements that I think most teachers will not skip out on because it's
yeah,
really important here.
yeah.
And then
I
just in terms
like
of a couple of yeah, go on.
I like that you sort of mentioned this idea, and it's important for people to frame this well under King James. I think it is during this time period, in which it's written. The world of magic, and this understanding of magic is definitely pretty relevant during this time. So that historical context in this time period, there's a bit of an exploration there as well. And then as you're, I'm sure, going to move forward a little bit, I like that idea of colonization because it's based. If I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I sort of read up on, it's like based off a shipwreck in Bermuda that inspired the play. This is something that I've sort of really found intriguing because you look at the ocean, you look at how big it is, and this idea of colonization, as you said, was becoming very, very prominent during this time period. So I think it's
Yeah.
something that our teachers should definitely drill in or nail in when looking at it. And even if you're a student listening, do your research on the
hmm
context really, really well. And this is just that historical context that we're speaking on. But anyway, I'll let you continue. I just thought it was really good to
No,
sort of point out those
definitely.
two things.
No, it's
Yeah.
great. Yeah, it's great that you pointed it out because very much so the exploration and colonization of parts of the
Mm,
Americas here is really
mm,
profound, which links really well to your point about Bermuda here. And so
mm,
when we're looking at this colonization, we're inherently looking at ideas of slavery and ownership,
mm,
which
mm,
most of your students would have a very basic understanding of, slaves and that kind of
yeah,
civil rights movement. So it's a nice way to tap into that, and this is the backstory to all of that as
mm,
well. And just quickly, there are a couple of other little contexts that teachers might like to incorporate. So when we're looking at the context of our different characters, so obviously Prospero, our protagonist, embodies that power and authority as a duke. So again, we've got that real I guess like monarchical sort of system at play. So your students probably
mm,
need to have a bit of a base understanding of that too. Caliban, our literary other in this play. So looking
yeah,
at ideas of otherness and those representations might be helpful here for his characterization as well. And really how his mother Sycorax is symbolizing the fear and misunderstanding of the
mm,
indigenous communities that the European colonizers were coming across. And Ariel here, even though Ariel plays a spirit here, who's conjured up and assists Prospero, really it's representing, these ideas of servitude and loyalty and, the nature of servitude in the face of autonomy and freedom, which again is, I think,
mm,
a maybe a contextual element that your students might not understand as much in our time frame, but very much
yeah,
something important for them to understand, yeah, in the world of the play. And just one more thing too is there's also a lot of philosophical context at play here, particularly these ideas of humanism, which were really, really prominent during the Renaissance here.
yeah,
So we know that the Jacobean era was influenced by these humanist thoughts and that real emphasis on individual agency, individual morality, and then just the complexities of different humans and different experiences. So, sort
mm,
of veering off a little bit from that real structured, great chain of being. And
yeah,
well, as human beings, we don't just live to physically exist, and the hand we're
mm,
dealt is not just the hand we're dealt, actually looking at these real humanist principles and understandings. And so that struggle of nature and the human condition really, really plays out in the play with multiple
yeah,
characters. Yeah, so I think there's quite a few different bits of context there. I guess an overview of those will be really helpful. And then I suppose what you tap into more specifically might be really dependent on what module you're teaching it in and what
yeah,
kind of core issues you might be using to guide you. But that's a bit of a sum up of the world of the
yeah,
Tempest.
yeah. It's a rich text, isn't it? And it's quite interesting. We look at a lot of Shakespeare's work, and we either
Very
put them
rich.
in two streams, either tragedy or comedy, and we see elements of both within the Tempest, thus, putting it under that tragi-comedy sort of genre that we have come to love
That's right.
in our studies. Yeah, 100%. But can I just sort of ask and just expand a little bit more very quickly? I like this idea of the philosophical sort of way in looking at the text, and if we're
Mhm.
encouraging our teachers to maybe look at these elements, maybe through the lens of a critical study or more of those in-depth close studies that they may be using it in. I think these questions about the humans at that time, sorry, society at that time, these ideas of humanism, and you mentioned the nature of the human condition, you have to understand, like, during this historical context, there was a strict structure and a strict way of being, and it's very strict
Yeah.
society, especially in Shakespeare's world. So I think it's very, very important for our teachers to ask those questions, those philosophical questions
Mhm.
about the context, in order to get the students in and really make it relevant to their worlds. If you're a teacher teaching this text and any Shakespeare text, you really want to find those links, like what makes it shine, and this is why Shakespeare's works become so significant to us. But yeah, look, that was sort of just a little bit of a
Yeah.
throw in there. I thought it
That's
was
right.
really, really important. I like that idea of the moral dilemmas. A question that you could ask is power ethical?
I love that too. Yeah,
Throughout the studies, and it
definitely.
falls in line with our lit happens. This idea of a toxic work environment. Sorry, the lit or quit for today. That
Mhm.
idea of ethical
Mhm.
distribution of power. It's so relevant in our world right now. Um, I also like the fact
Definitely.
that you've alluded a little bit to the modern day adaptations of the play. So also thinking about
Mhm.
those links to, well, how could this be presented to us in some of those modern adaptations? Because let's be honest, most of the teachers will be asked these questions. Hey, is there a movie to do with this, sir or miss? Or
Mhm.
um, yeah, as we move forward. So I think we have to make those connections and links as well. But look, let's continue moving on with our little discussion, or else we'll be here forever. Because I enjoy the talk and the chat as well. But what are the
Yeah, I
links
do
that we
too.
can make? Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So what are some of those links that we can make to our preliminary advanced
yeah.
English syllabus if teachers are using this text?
Yeah, I think there are the play definitely works in all the modules. There are probably some modules that it's a little bit more easier lends itself to, but if we start with, let's say, our common module, our reading to write transition to senior English, certainly here looking at the style and genre of the Tempest would work really well here. So perhaps, a driving idea would be, how do composers experiment with form and genre to shape meaning? And so you could
Mm,
look at this hybrid genre of the romance and the tragedy and the comedy, and how all the elements are playing a role here.
yeah,
There's because the Tempest is really ideal when you're looking at like language and form and structure, particularly the way that prose and verse. Because I think the play is something like 80% verse and
yeah.
20% prose, so it's a very creative style of conveying the
Mm,
narrative. So when we
mm,
are looking at this, even when you're looking at the way that genre is playing, you can still consider, how the narrative is representing ideas of storytelling and who
yeah,
has the power and authority to tell stories, and how does that, how is that received? So you definitely can
yeah,
can look at that. So another big focus here could be then the meta theater of the play, because what the play is really doing here is it's getting us to consider, because like Prospero is kind of like the way that a director might be manipulating the situation,
yeah.
because that's entirely what Prospero is doing with his magic. So there's this real sense of the power that one has when they're crafting and creating,
Yeah.
and the impact that that has on readers and audiences. So very much so you could look at the meta theater aspects here. And
Mm,
so even looking
mm,
at things like fractured narration or
yeah,
reimagining the perspectives that are present on the island, and even looking at Miranda and Caliban's monologue and even reimagining or reinterpreting them. So
mm,
um,
mm,
while I think it's probably a very big text for common, because you like to do a few different text types, I think you
yeah,
certainly could do some extracts or sections.
yeah,
But I
yeah,
think if we definitely when we look at module A and B, it's a much more seamless fit. But, if
mm,
you are wanting to have that deep focus on genre, which look, the new module does have that component in the
yeah,
outcome points, you definitely could incorporate it and, use
yeah,
Tempest in a way that's maybe not commonly used when we're teaching English. So really
mm,
like that idea in terms of how you could incorporate it with the common module.
yeah, and, I guess we can go further here with module A and then moving
Yeah.
into module B. How would you see it relevant or be
Yeah.
relevant to the narratives that shape our world sort of component or idea?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know in narratives, a lot of us like to do a comparison, and I know that, we wouldn't be doing a comparison with we wouldn't be doing Hagseed with Tempest, but I think that there are a lot of texts that you can do that are representative of the different perspectives or lenses, and that could form a bit of
Mm,
a comparison. So I'll give some examples as we go, but really here, I think using Tempest to represent this idea of how narratives are constructing values and ideologies, and that
mm,
is deeply, deeply explored within this play. So,
yeah,
looking at perhaps colonial attitudes. So
yeah,
if you were going to, reframe that with something, you might even do an extract from Heart of Darkness because of how that
yeah,
does that comparison of, the outsider, what it means to be human, that idea of the
mm,
the darkness of the unknown. So even that
mm,
idea of savagery comes to mind
yeah,
here. I think other than colonial attitudes, you could also do the ideas of what leadership and authority is. So,
yep,
definitely doing something a bit outside of that scope where you might be actually drawing in speeches to do with leadership
mm,
and authority. Because even though Prospero, starts off as maybe not the best ruler or leader, there is some progress towards the end of the play. And then there are also questions that are still left, not quite understood yet, but definitely has a very moral and philosophical approach to this idea of
yeah,
true leadership, which I think links nicely to the humanism. And then even looking at ideas of like forgiveness and justice, because those can be very, very contextually steeped as well. So,
mm,
you could do a more modern text that has some sort of representation of justice and perhaps look at like the parallels and the similarities and differences there. But
yeah,
um, other things that you could do separate from perspectives, if you're looking at bigger concepts, so obviously the colonial narrative is the huge one here. The civilizer versus the civilized, and
yep,
those moral implications of, well, who determines who is civilized and uncivilized,
mm,
and what is the power and right and responsibility for those that are civilizing the
yep,
uncivilized. That's a big thing that looking at how language even constructs power could work here.
yeah,
The redemption narrative as well might be really big, is looking at these redemption arcs, perhaps between
mm,
Tempest and another text. So, how even the play moves from chaos to reconciliation, and really the fact that for Prospero to give forgiveness, that's really reshapes, the moral
yeah,
trajectory that the play then takes as it sort of kicks off. And yeah, and then so perhaps as well, if you're looking at more historical narratives, you might be looking at, the magic and supernatural representations, the humanist representations,
yeah,
even that kind of European the expansionism that was taking place. So, because
mm,
what you could do here then is a possible assessment for Mod A might be, how it's shaping understandings of power or
yeah,
identity or of human
mm,
conditions. So there's a lot of scope here to be able to just pepper it with perspectives, lenses, context. I think there's a lot that can be done here with Mod A, and I think Mod A is going to be a really, really popular spot for
yeah,
Tempest. Even though you can't do Hagseed, like I would love to do Tempest with a couple of extracts from Heart of Darkness.
yeah,
Like for me, that would
yeah,
I would be really keen to give that a go because I think they'd work really nicely. But there's so many,
mm,
so many other examples for Module A. But I think that's something that we could do to align to the core
yeah,
principles of Mod A.
100%, 100%. We might do an episode on Heart
Yeah,
of Darkness later on, as a text that we could
love
add
that. We
in,
both
yeah,
love
and see the
that.
links. Yeah, that'd be good. That'd be good. Yeah, what about Module B, Bill?
Yeah. So module B, so when we're looking at, how to link it to module B hasn't changed that much, I guess, in the new prescriptions, but obviously
Mm,
a lot of people in advanced tend to do like an Othello for module B. That's now being moved into the advanced HSC course. So people are probably thinking, what could I do? So if you still want to do a Shakespeare in your module
yeah.
B, you could do Tempest here, absolutely. So because we've got that close analysis and we're evaluating textual integrity and we're exploring enduring values and we're considering these multiple interpretations, Tempest is really ideal for this. So
Mm,
given that it is
mm,
that Shakespearean romance, a tragic comedy, looking at a close focus could be power through language. So that might
yeah.
be, something conceptual that you use, and then students can branch off into their own ideas here. So, power of language is really important. And when you're looking at Prospero, his speech is very elevated. It's quite rhetorical. It's got that, sense of authority behind it.
Mm,
But when you're looking
mm,
at the way that Caliban's language is, even though sometimes it's quite full of rage and quite harsh, it's also balanced so well by this beautiful like
yeah.
poetic quality to it. Yeah,
Yeah.
so here I think it's a really cool way to look at how language can represent or even subvert
Mm,
representations of the savage.
mm,
And that was probably something I didn't mention much in mod A that I might, and I'm going to talk about a little bit later with some of the ideas, but because when you're looking at module A, you're looking at dominant and resistant readings. So therefore
mm,
the colonial perspectives read really well here, and even those ideas of power and servitude read really well
yeah.
for that. Nonetheless, you could do a focus on the meta theater here, so that meditation on artistic power. So even though
Yeah.
in the play, Prospero is a sorcerer, the way that he creates the environment around him very much, and obviously this is a theatrical performance, so we've got those the
Mm,
stagecraft elements, but very much having students consider the power of art and the way that it can manipulate or shape or control.
yeah.
Another thing that maybe you might look at for module B is looking at the structural elements of it. So the way it
Mm,
begins with that chaos and that storm and ends with that order and restoration. So we've got that movement from, tempestuousness and vengeance into, calm and forgiveness as well. So,
yeah.
with that, students could question that, you talked about morality a bit earlier in our app.
Mm,
So even
mm,
this idea of like, is forgiveness possible? Is forgiveness sincere?
yeah.
Is Prospero benevolent or authoritarian? Does
Yeah.
Caliban truly gain freedom? So there's a lot that can be explored through that structure of chaos to order, and then students
Mm,
could make a
mm,
determination of whether there truly is order at the end,
yeah.
because I think that could be open to interpretation. And lastly, if you're looking at critical approaches to pepper your mod A, which usually most of us try to include a couple because we do want students to incorporate a bit of a reading or a bit of an approach. So
Mhm.
post-colonial readings, as we've talked about, really big here. Psychoanalytic readings, so even looking
Yeah.
at Prospero and even his role as a controlling
Mm,
father. Like yes, he controls Miranda and he sets up the whole scenario and situation, but looking at perhaps his relationship with Caliban as well, and how he
yeah.
tries to present this kind of father figure here too. So even
Yeah.
looking at more humanist readings, these ideas of the power of forgiveness, the power of mercy,
Mm,
and even the moral restoration that can kind of come
yeah.
through forgiveness as opposed to vengeance. And so, for questions like that might be, or approaches you might take in a module B, then might be something like the ethics of power. Is
Mm,
Prospero a figure of control or compassion? I think this would generate a lot of different viewpoints and opinions from your students, because I feel like each of us that read Tempest will have a very different approach or interpretation
yeah.
or alignment with certain characters. Yeah,
Yeah.
but
And it's one of those
yeah, to sum
yeah.
up, yeah,
Yeah,
go on.
it's one of those common sort of themes, ideas that we see with Shakespeare's texts. I mentioned this, I think, in one of our episodes previously, but every time I've read The Merchant, for example, of Venice, you just get
Mm,
different ideas, and it's through which lens you read it. And I think it's important that you
absolutely.
noted that the interpretation, whether it be post-colonial, whether you have a psychoanalytical sort of look at the text, I think it's important for students to engage with this because this allows the students to move away from that very horizontal sort of way of maybe summarizing or retelling the plot line of what occurs in the play and actually gets into the critical reading or the critical analysis which is needed or prescribed by this module B unit. So I think it's very important, in particular, if you are looking to do this as a mod B text, to definitely look at those elements that Bill has mentioned, and really go into depth with them. And one of the questions, if you're a teacher starting off this critical lens, you might say, like, what do you think? I mean, this is a question that you'll ask yourself: which critical lens will our students engage with the most? You can give them multiple ones, but consider
Mm,
your cohort, consider who your
mhm.
kids are, and really then delve into it, because then you'll have that buy-in, and then you'll have that want or that intrigue that will then foster kids wanting to do that further research. Hopefully beyond just AI adaptations
Yeah.
or, hey AI, tell me this or that, but going in and
Yeah.
wanting to know a lot more about whichever lens they're viewing the text through. So I think it's important that you did mention that, and you've definitely provided
Absolutely.
us a great breakdown of those links. But let's further this a little bit moving forward. What key
Mhm.
ideas and language choices shape meaning in the Tempest? So let's get a little bit into the text. I know we've already covered some bits and pieces, but I guess this is
Mhm.
what our teachers and students alike will be wanting to know. So I'll give you the floor.
Yeah. Sure. So, you know, like you said, we've already mentioned some of them, but let's just go in a little bit more detail. I won't try and not take up too much time. But looking at power and control is a big one. You know, an entire essay could be based just on these
Mm,
notions. So, particularly here, how Prospero's use of magic and command over others really makes us question the role and power of authority. And so, kind of
mm,
sub ideas that might come from this is like, or how is power exercised, who deserves to have power, who has the
mm.
right to have authority over others, and what are the moral limits of power. So that's probably the bigger one that I feel a lot of students might build a thesis around. So
Yeah.
when we're looking at this, the play's asking, whether power should be absolute. Is power something you are born with? Is power something
Mm,
you must acquire? Is power something that's innate? Is power, something that needs to be tempered by mercy? And are we,
mm.
in fact, more powerful when we use mercy and forgiveness to temper that power? So,
Yeah. I
Prospero
just
ultimately, when he really, yeah,
yeah,
hmm
yeah, I'll add there, one of the questions you could ask your kids, or even if you're a student, is he benevolent or is he tyrannical in terms of the way he
yes,
demonstrates that power? And you mentioned
yes,
like that idea of power
hmm
being, or sorry, Prospero's magic being a metaphor maybe for authority throughout the entire text. I think definitely power
hmm
and control is one of those massive parts of this text that
definitely,
students will view it through.
yeah.
But anyway, continue going. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Yeah, no, absolutely. And that idea of then, well, when he relinquishes that magical control or that
Mm,
magical dominion at the end of the play, what does that mean? What does that highlight or represent in terms of power
mm,
or authority? So I think you said that really nicely. And so then,
mm,
another lens might be, how Prospero's control and manipulation of all within his island,
mm. Yeah.
his island. Um, actually mirrors the role of an artist or the role of a
Mm,
playwright in manipulating characters and events to create the narrative that they would wish to create. And so here we see that blurring of the lines between
yeah.
creator and controller. So that is a very like meta approach that I think would play out really nicely in analysis for senior students.
Mm,
Um, Another big idea, I might look at some language further down. I might just kind of highlight some
yep.
of the ideas first, and then we can kind of take a look at some key elements. So, another big idea, obviously, colonization and otherness. I think that and like power and authority, I think tend to be the two biggest ones that
Yeah.
I see in responses, or that I know of teachers, leading their
Mm,
analysis with. So, obviously, this one, is Caliban's native island, and
yeah.
he is the colonized other, because when Prospero arrives, he subjugates and rules him. And
Mm,
so, he's got this bitter claim of, this island's mine, by Sycorax my mother, which thou takes from me. And that really exposes the injustice of Prospero's dominance. So obviously here we're having that element of ownership and indigenous rights sort of playing
Mm.
out in in an older text, but certainly is something that students can link to modern day in
Yeah.
terms of land rights and land ownership, and all those kinds of scenarios. So that's a big one here. So this relationship between Prospero and Caliban is echoing the early modern expansion of European empires, where the idea of
Mm.
they're going to civilize the indigenous peoples. And even though this is a relationship that began centuries ago, it's really still in effect today. There's a lot that we can
Yeah.
see in our modern world that is a representation or is playing out after centuries of that kind of colonization and subjugation.
Yeah.
So I think this is a very accessible lens for students. There are a lot of modern day works, even a lot of classic literature that is highlighting, subjugation and colonization. So there's a lot to be
Mm.
done here. And so also, I think what makes this play really interesting is Caliban can be quite ambiguous in nature because
Yeah.
sometimes he is quite rough and brutal. I mean, there's that situation in the play where it alludes to him, trying to sexually attack,
Mm.
I won't say the word, Miranda.
Mm.
And so there's
Mm.
there's definitely a complexity in this play because Caliban himself is not necessarily a weak figure to be pitied entirely. There are very deep representations of potential savagery here,
Yeah.
and also parts of deep humanity here. And so I think that's what makes the discussion here even more complex,
Mm.
because Caliban is not necessarily stereotypical all the time. He's got his own complexity, he's got his own thoughts, he's got his own
Yeah.
opinions. Then there's his own perspective of what happened with Miranda, and it just
Mm.
creates that ambiguity that really forces everyone to question ideas about power, and how that, whether you have power or not, can impact your sense of identity, and how
Yeah.
power not only dehumanizes another, but can absolutely define the other and how they see themselves and how they see
Yeah.
their world. So that's a big one. Yeah, colonization and otherness.
Mm.
Um, one that's probably not. I feel like it depends if you're interested in this as a teacher, whether you might actually go down this route. But the idea of magic, illusion, and reality, which I
Yeah.
personally love because I think it's not done as often, particularly this idea of like what's real, what's not, what's an illusion. There's
Mm.
a lot of dream motifs in the play. So obviously, because magic is central here to the world of the Tempest, not only does he create these spectacular scenes and these enchanting illusions, but then there's that feel of, well, any action that comes out of this, enchantment, is that reality? Can it be real if it's been manipulated? And that's
Yeah.
a really fascinating questions, yeah, to pose to students. This idea that life itself or art
Mm.
is art an illusion, or and this is where Prospero says we are such stuff as dreams are made on. So this idea that the human experience itself is quite transient and maybe
Yeah.
open to chance and open to manipulation. So I think it's a really interesting take to consider, well, what
Mm.
is
Mm.
reality, what is illusion, is there a blurring of the two? Yeah, I think that's a real interesting one. And then also obviously forgiveness or justice or redemption is a huge
Yep.
one. So even though Prospero initially seeks revenge on Antonio and all those who wronged him, in the end we reach a forgiveness and reconciliation. So that symbolic renunciation of magic, which we already talked about, is sort of a representation perhaps of
Mm.
his finally achieving a conscience of his actions here. And
Yeah.
this idea that justice doesn't come solely through punishment. Justice is also perhaps about healing, letting go, moral growth as well.
Mm. 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 Yeah.
Three more I won't elaborate on. I'll just kind of list them. Human nature and monstrosity, especially when looking at civilized and savage. Betrayal and treason, if we're looking more at the political realm and Antonio's actions
Yeah.
here. And freedom and imprisonment is a real big one if you're looking at the relationship between Ariel and between Ariel and Prospero, because even though Caliban is obviously being subjugated, Ariel very much is as well. He does his bidding, and it's different because he doesn't necessarily quite have that same awareness of Caliban, of his subjugation. So
Yeah.
it also brings up those questions. So those are kind of the big ideas, I think, that we see
Mm,
across the play.
mm, yeah, no, that's good. That's good. Were there any sort of language sort of ideas or maybe
Yeah,
features of the text that you could quickly list off for our listeners as well, just so
yeah,
they've got like an eye
yeah,
in to, like we've got the great ideas, but what are some of those language choices, maybe structural features,
definitely.
textual features that we can
Yeah,
analyze as well?
definitely. Yeah, so in terms of structural features, there's quite a lot in this place. When you're looking at your big structural features, you've obviously got the